Okay, so we wouldn't be talking about the 20th and 21st centuries without global conflicts and their consequences, which is the general focus of this presentation. So, at the beginning of the 20th century, you have a European dominated global political order, which also included the US, Russia, and Japan, which again we saw in the previous period being created. And over the course of the 20th century, peoples and states around the world challenged this order in ways that sought to redistribute power within the existing order and to restructure empires, while peoples and states sought to overturn the political order itself. These challenges, too, and the attempts to maintain the political order manifested themselves in an unprecedented level of conflict with a lot of human casualties. In the context of these conflicts, many regimes in both older and newer states struggled with maintaining political stability, and they were often challenged by internal and external factors, including ethnic and religious conflicts, secessionist movements, territorial partitions, economic dependency, and the legacies of colonialism. So Europe dominated the global political order at the beginning of the 20th century, but both land-based and transoceanic empires gave way to new states by the century's end. This was a 2013 DBQ topic as it came up on the AP World exam. So the older land-based Ottoman, Russian, and Qing empires collapsed due to a combination of internal and external factors. You've got political and social discontent with what's going on. You have technological and economic stagnation, so not really growth. And then a lot of military defeat. So that's a commonality between all three of these regions during this time period. So Qing China in 1911 became a republic. Tsarist Russia in 1917 went from essentially a monarchy to the Soviet Union. And the Ottoman Empire was disbanded in 1923 and became Turkey. So some colonies negotiated their independence, like India from the British Empire. So Indian independence movement lasted from roughly 757 to 1947. Lasted a while. Um, they wanted to end the East India Trading Company rule from 1757 to 1858, and then they wanted to end the British Indian Empire in 1858 to 1947. Um, the Indian National Congress sought the basic right to appear for Indian civil service examinations, so to participate in the bureaucracy, as well as more rights for the people of India in general. The last stages saw Congress adopt Mahatma Gandhi's policy of nonviolence and civil resistance, and India's self-rule movement led to Indian Independence Act of 1947, which also created Pakistan. And the Republic of India was created in 1950, and Pakistan became independent in 1956, as well as Bangladesh in 1971. The Gold Coast from the British Empire. So in 1956, they requested their independence from British rule, and they were declared an independent state of Ghana on March 6, 1957, as a Commonwealth. And in 1960, it was declared a republic. You also have French West Africa, where 1895 to 1958, it struggled for its independence. It became the French Fifth Republic of 1958, which changed them from the French Union to the French Community, which essentially made it a protectorate in fancy terms. Guinea voted for independence in 1958, and in 1950, Senegal and French Sudan became part of the Mali Federation. Ivory Coast, Niger, Upper Volta, and Dahomey formed the Sahel Benin Union, which was short lived. But you do have Guinea getting their independence in 1958. Some colonies were able to achieve independence through armed struggle. So, Algeria and Vietnam. First, we'll talk about Algeria. The Algerian War for Independence lasted from 1954 to 1962. It was France versus the Algerian National Liberation Front. It was basically guerrilla warfare, with a lot of guerrilla fighting and the use of torture by both sides. It was not a good conflict. And then it became a conflict between loyalist Algerians that supported a French Algeria and their Algerian national counterparts. So eventually, 1962, they did get their independence, but they have had cultural infighting as well. Then Vietnam, the first Indochina War lasted from December 1946 to August 1954. it was an anti-French resistance war. So they wanted France out of Vietnam. The French Union's French Far East Expeditionary Corps versus the Viet Minh, which were led by Ho Chi Minh and the People's Army of Vietnam. And then it ultimately led into the Second Indochina War, which lasted from November 1955 to April of 1975, which pitted the Soviet Union versus the United States because the United States didn't want the spread of communism containment. So you had two wars for control of Vietnam, basically. The Angolan War of Independence lasted from 1961 to 1974. It began as an uprising against forced cotton cultivation, and then it became a multi-faction struggle for the control of Portugal's overseas province of Angola among three nationalist movements and a separatist movement. It ultimately led to the Civil War of Angola, which lasted from 1975 to 2002. So there was a lot of violence within Africa and Asia to rid themselves of colonial control or imperial control. You have emerging ideologies of anti-imperialism contributing to the dissolution of empires and the restructuring of states. Within that, you've got nationalist leaders and parties in Asia and Africa challenging imperial rule. So the Indian National Congress and Mahatma Gandhi challenged the British rule. Ho Chi Minh in French Indochina to challenge French rule in Vietnam, and Kwame Nkrumah in the British Gold Coast, now Ghana. You've got regional, religious, and ethnic movements challenging both colonial rule and inheriting imperial boundaries. So Muhammad Ali Jinnah was a lawyer, a politician, and the founder of Pakistan. He served as the leader of the All India Muslim League until Pakistan's creation, and then as Pakistan's first governor general, which was basically representative in Pakistan of the British monarch, until his death. You have the Quebecois separatist movement, where Quebec sovereignty was a political movement as well as an ideology of like values, concepts, and ideas that advocated independence for the Canadian province of Quebec. Still exists today. And then you've got the Biafra secessionist movement, which their aim was securing the resurgence of the defunct state of Biafra from Nigeria. So think about those different ethnic groups within the arbitrary lines drawn by the imperialist nations of Europe during the Fifth Period. Nigeria has had a crackdown against the group for the past few years, including violently arresting them. You've got the movement for the actualization of the sovereign state of Biafra, or MASSOB. They were declared to be an extremist group in May 2013 by the president of Nigeria, and that's part of that crackdown against the Biafra secessionist movement. So sometimes it's peaceful, sometimes it's violent, but you do have these regional, religious, and ethnic movements as part of the change of political climate at this time. You have transnational movements seeking to unite people across national boundaries, like communism. You see that throughout the world in this time period. You have Pan-Africanism, which was the worldwide intellectual movement that aimed to encourage and strengthen the bonds of solidarity between all people of African descent. And Pan-Arabism, which was an ideology espousing the unification of the countries of North Africa and West Asia, and it was closely connected to Arab nationalism, which asserts that the Arabs constitute a single nation instead of separate nations. And it reached its height of popularity during the 50s and 60s, and often socialist principles and strongly opposed Western political involvement in the Arab world, which we see in a lot of the revolutions and rebellions in the Arab world of this time period too. It is also an alliance in economic cooperation with Arab states still today. You've got the redistribution of land and resources within states in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, sometimes advocating for communism and socialism. You can see the communist and socialist movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America on the map in red. You have political changes accompanied by major demographic and social consequences at this point in time. So you've got redrawing of old colonial boundaries leading to population resettlements and not always happiness. So the India-Pakistan partition, you've got the 1947 division, which accompanied the creation of two independent dominions, the Dominion of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. And it was Pakistan 1, Pakistan 2, or West Pakistan, East Pakistan. Today, it's known as Pakistan and Bangladesh. Bangladesh was East Pakistan. Um, and it's basically divided between Hindu and Muslim majorities. And you still have fighting, especially in the area of Kashmir, which is north of West Pakistan and India. You have the Zionist Jewish settlement of Palestine, where the Zionists had a goal of creating a Jewish national home and cultural center in Palestine to facilitate Jewish migration there because they really haven't been able to settle in their homeland for a long time. After the Holocaust, the movement focused on a specific Jewish state, which in 1948 became the creation of Israel. And it's led to a lot of conflict within Palestine because Palestine and the Muslims there lost a lot of their land, and there's been a lot of fighting with the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You have the division of the Middle East into mandates following World War I, which were created under Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. The territories after the war that they were no longer ruled by their previous imperial nation, but according to the League of Nations, they were unable to stand by themselves under the strenuous conditions of the modern world. So major examples of that would be like Lebanon, Palestine, Transjordan, Syria, and Iraq. You have political changes being accompanied by major demographic and social consequences. So the migration of former colonial subjects to imperial metropoles, which metropoles were metropolitan centers of empires, they maintained cultural and economic ties between the colony and the metropole, even after the dissolution of empires. So the South Asians went to Britain, specifically like London, and they kept that connection between the South Asian nations and Britain. Algerians moved to France and urban cities there and also kept that connection. And you also see it with Filipinos coming to the United States and especially US cities. You have a lot of conflicts leading to various forms of ethnic violence and displacement of peoples, resulting in refugee populations. You have the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Empire in the 1920s. You have the Holocaust, which was against Jews and political dissidents by the Nazis in World War II. Rwanda, that was the Tutsi genocide by the Hutu. Cambodia, you had Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge killing intellectuals. Palestinians, you have Arab Christians leaving Palestine as a result of oppression, and since 1948, you have the Arab-Israeli War. Palestinians have experienced several waves of exile and have spread into different host countries around the world. In Darfur, you have a major armed conflict in the Darfur region in Sudan between the Sudan Liberation Movement and the Justice and Equality Movement rebel groups, and they fought the Sudanese government starting in 2003 because they accused the government of oppressing Darfur's non-Arab population. The government then carried out a campaign of ethnic cleansing against Darfur's non-Arabs. It's officially a mass genocide, and it has technically been in a ceasefire since February of 2010, but that doesn't mean that it can't start up at any point. Military conflicts occurred on an unprecedented global scale. So World War I and World War II were the first total wars where governments used ideologies, including fascism, nationalism, and communism, to mobilize all of their states' resources, including the people, both in the home countries and the colonies or former colonies, for the purpose of waging war. So one major example would be the Gurkha soldiers in India. Today, all units of the British Army that are composed of Nepalese soldiers are known as the Brigade of Gurkhas. Originally, they served in the Indian Army prior to Indian independence, but to help fight in World War I and World War II on behalf of the British. The Anzac troops in Australia were Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, They were World War I Army Corps of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force, and they served in Gallipoli, which is in Egypt. Um, and you also have military conscription, which was drafting, compulsory enlistment of people in military service, which the United States has done it multiple times. Governments also used a variety of strategies, including political speeches, art, media, and intensified forms of nationalism to mobilize these populations. Basically, think propaganda. And every government is guilty of using propaganda against their people in order to get them to do something. You can even look at brands that use propaganda to get you to buy their product. Global conflict. You've got sources of global conflict varying. You have imperialist expansion by European powers in Japan, causing a lot of ruffling of feathers. You've got competition for resources, ethnic conflict between various ethnic groups, great power rivalries between Great Britain and Germany. You have nationalist ideologies where my country is the best country ever. And the economic crisis engendered by the Great Depression helped to lead to World War II. Yay! The balance of power, whether it's economic or political, shifted after the end of World War II. So you had your imperialist nations prior to World War II, and it shifted to evolve into the Cold War following World War II. So you got the US versus the Soviet Union as your major superpowers, and you have the ideological struggles between capitalism and communism throughout the globe. So the new Cold War produced new military alliances, including NATO, so the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact, and it promoted proxy wars in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. The Ethio-Somali War, which was Somalia versus Ethiopia, where the Soviet Union supported Ethiopia and the US supported Somalia. Guatemala was when the United Fruit Company was alarmed by land reforms instituted by the communist leader of Guatemala, Arbenz. The United Fruit Company then lobbied friends in the US government to have him removed. So in 1954, Eisenhower ordered the CIA to execute a coup to replace the Arbenz government with one aligned with US interests. Theoretically, these nations were part of the non-aligned movement where they did not want to pick a side, the US versus the Soviet Union. They wanted to stay, mind their own business, deal with their own countries. It was an isolationist type view. But it didn't always work where they stayed non-aligned. Quite often, they pitted countries against each other, and they got the superpowers involved in their conflicts, as stated with the Ethio-Somali War and Guatemala. You have the dissolution of the Soviet Union, effectively ending the Cold War, so it lasted about 45 years or so. The Berlin Wall fell in 1989, opening up East and West Berlin. Glasnost, which was openness, and perestroika, restructuring. So glasnost was your political reforms, and perestroika was your economic reforms in the Soviet Union, all led by Mikhail Gorbachev. And he ultimately was the last president of the Soviet Union, but he became the first president of Russia afterwards. So you had the fall of the Soviet Union. And some of it even was caused by just nationalism in general. A lot of the satellite nations of the Soviet Union were like, hey, we care about ourselves here, not really about the overall Soviet Union. Although conflict dominated a lot of the 20th century, many individuals and groups, including states, opposed this trend. And some individuals and groups, however, intensified the conflict. So you got both sides of the coin. The groups and individuals that challenged the many wars of the century, and some promoted nonviolence as a way to bring about political change. I'm going to briefly go over them here and then go over them further later. So the ones who challenged war, you've got Pablo Picasso in his Guernica painting. You have the anti-nuclear movement during the Cold War, basically stop producing nuclear weapons and definitely don't fire them at each other. Thich Quang Duc, we'll talk about his self-immolation in a minute. Nonviolence, practitioners of nonviolence were Mohandas Gandhi, and then Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela in South Africa learned and used Gandhi's techniques. So Pablo Picasso's Guernica. He challenged the war in June 1937. So remember, Spain was going through a civil war at this point in time. Picasso created this painting in response to the bombing of Guernica, Spain, on April 26, 1937, by Nazi German and fascist Italian warplanes at the request of the Spanish nationalists. Many people died, and it was considered horrific because it was the first time a military force was being used to kill civilians. It was mass casualties. Um, so you can see the chaos that Picasso felt within his painting. And there are several analyses online of what everything officially stands for. But know that Pablo Picasso's Guernica was his protest against the Spanish Civil War. Thich Quang Duc, he uh, burned himself to death at a busy Saigon Road intersection. He was a Vietnamese Mahana Buddhist monk, and on June 11th, 1963, he burned himself to death, as you see in that photo. He was protesting the persecution of Buddhists by the South Vietnamese government, and several Buddhist monks then followed in his example. It's a very, very effective way to get your point across, even if you don't continue making the point. Mohandas Gandhi, also known as Mahatma, meaning great soul, he fought for Indian independence from British rule and for the rights of the Indian poor, especially through nonviolent protest. Unfortunately, he was assassinated at the end of his life, but he preached nonviolent protest and believed it to be incredibly important. And he influenced many, many people throughout the world with his nonviolent actions. He was incredibly well educated. He was a lawyer trained by the British government. And then he went to start nonviolent resistance movements in South Africa as well as India. Martin Luther King Jr. was an American clergyman and activist in the civil rights movement. He advocated for using nonviolent resistance, inspired by Gandhi. He gave his I Have a Dream speech at the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, wanting to end racial segregation and discrimination. Before his death in '68, he wanted to end poverty and stop the Vietnam War. Nelson Mandela was a South African anti-apartheid revolutionary and politician. He was the president of South Africa from 1994 to 1999. He was the first black head of state in South Africa. They had been ruled by the minority whites. He was first elected. He was the first head of state elected in a fully representative democratic election in South Africa. He focused on dismantling the legacy of apartheid and tackling institutionalized racism, which was basically legalized racism for apartheid. He was in prison from 1962 to 1990, and he believed in nonviolent resistance as well, also influenced by Gandhi. Groups and individuals, including the Nonaligned Movement, opposed and promoted alternatives to the existing economic, political, and social orders. So the Nonaligned Movement was against picking sides in the Cold War, as I said before. Your communist leaders Ho Chi Minh and Mao Zedong. Ho Chi Minh founded the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, or North Vietnam, and he also supported the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War. Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China, aka Communist China. The anti-apartheid movement in South Africa was led by Nelson Mandela, and it was focused on nonviolent resistance, and it worked against white racism and segregation required by law under apartheid. Your global uprisings of 1968, there are a lot of different social revolutions caused by escalation of political repression. So in Poland, you have student and Jewish rights being fought for. You have civil rights in the United States. West Germany had student movements. Scandinavia was against the participation of two apartheid nations in the international tennis competition held in Sweden. Mexico was protesting against the admittance of South African teams to the Summer Olympics because they were against apartheid. Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet Union, so there were global uprisings there. Brazil also had uprisings. Spain was against dictator Francisco Franco and wanting democracy. In Argentina and several European cities, you also have uprisings. So 1968 was tumultuous for several different reasons. The environmental movement can also trace its roots to the protests of 1968. The Tiananmen Square protesters promoted democracy in China. They were student-led demonstrations in Beijing in 1989. You see the picture in the top right is the man standing in front of the tanks. Um, Demonstrations forcibly suppressed by the government because the government declared martial law against the demonstrations. Troops with assault rifles and tanks killed at least several hundred demonstrators trying to block the military's advance towards Tiananmen Square. Militaries and militarized states often responded to the proliferation of conflicts in ways that further intensified conflict. So you've got promotion of military dictatorship in Chile, Spain, Uganda. In Spain, you've got the Spanish Civil War lasting from 1936 to 1975 when Francisco Franco took control of Spain. It ended when the Spanish Constitution of 1978 went into effect and it became an autocratic dictatorship. In Chile, 1973 to 1990, the authoritarian military government in Chile, Salvador Allende, was overthrown by a CIA-backed coup, and then the dictatorship was headed by General Augusto Pinochet. Uganda, you've got Idi Amin leading a coup and overthrowing the Ugandan government, and he served as the president of Uganda. His rule was characterized by human rights abuses, political repression, ethnic persecution, corruption, and so on. Also during this time, you have the buildup of the military-industrial complex and weapons trading. So the military-industrial complex is a fancy term, and it's an informal alliance between a nation's military and the arms industry, which supplies it, which is seen as a public policy thing. One side benefits by obtaining war weapons, and then the other side gets paid to supply them. It's mostly seen in the United States in the Cold War. You have more movements using violence against civilians to achieve political aims, terrorism in essence. The IRA, the Irish Republican Army. So that was armed movements in Ireland dedicated to Irish republicanism and the belief that all of Ireland should be an independent republic. The ETA, the Basque Homeland and Liberty. It's an armed leftist Basque nationalist and separatist organization in Basque Country, which is northern Spain and southwestern France. And it was founded in 1959, and its goal was gaining independence for Basque. Al Qaeda, which literally translated to the base, militant Sunni Islamist multinational organization founded in 1988 by Osama bin Laden and Abdullah Azzam. And they fought against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s, and actually the United States backed Osama bin Laden in that because of containment. They were Islamist extremists, and they are a terrorist group. They mounted attacks on civilian and military targets in various countries, including the United States on multiple accounts, but largely 9/11. Suicide attacks are common, and simultaneous bombings of different targets as well are very common with Al Qaeda's mode. Global conflicts had a profound influence on popular culture as well. So, Dada was the art movement of the European avant garde in the early 20th centuries. It rejected the logic, reason, and aestheticism of modern capitalist society, instead expressing nonsense, irrationality, anti bourgeois protest in their works. If you look at the top left photo, you see the Mona Lisa with a goatee and stuff drawn on her. You can see it's rejecting the rationality. James Bond, the focus is on a fictional British Secret Service agent, but you look at the Cold War and the interconnectedness of the world, and you see the influence of that in James Bond. You have socialist realism, which is a style of realistic art that was developed in the Soviet Union and became a dominant style in that country and other socialist countries. It glorified the depiction of communist values like the emancipation of the proletariat by means of realistic imagery. So in the image above, you see Stalin surrounded by kids. Everything looks great. There's a bouquet. It's beautiful. It's sunny. You see the coast. So everything looks great. Video games also, you see the influence of global conflicts on popular culture, like Call of Duty, Metal Gear Solid, Medal of Honor. Various video games, you see reflections of global conflict in the popular culture.